What's going on, gangsters? MovieJohn here. We're going to talk about the 80s. Oh yeah, remembering the 80s, the movies. Now, I grew up in the 80s. 1980 rolled around, I was 4. Well, I turned 5 at the end of the year in December, but I was 4 in 1980 at the beginning of the year. Didn't remember a whole lot about 1980, but later on, as I got a little older, I do remember a lot of stuff. And movies from the 80s, well, you could have some cheesy ones, you can have some really good classics, and just everything else in between. But along with movies, you also had stuff like VCRs coming about. And I remember the very first VCR I ever got. It was about that long, about that damn thick. And my dad and mom, I think, said they paid around $600 or $700 for it. And then by the end of the 80s, oh hell, you can remember damn VCRs probably costing $30, $40. And then later on, you could get them for almost nothing. Man, the 80s, man, movies in the 80s, there's so many great comedies and stuff. I'm not going to really mention them all right here. I'll throw up some pictures of my favorite comedies from the 80s. And dramas and horror movies were really big for me, because growing up in the 80s and loving horror, I started watching Friday the 13th and stuff like Nightmare on Elm Street. And, you know, all them other classics and the Halloween sequels and stuff by that time. And just, you know, loving cinema. I just started at a young age, and what better decade to start in the 1980s, especially when the VCRs came out. Damn, I remember. And the video stores, the rental video stores, I was going to say the video rental stores was great, man. Nowadays, you know, you tell kids this stuff and they don't really get it. You know, you can go to Redbox or you can stream online or whatever. But just to go into the video store back then, and you had the VHS there, and you had the movie behind it, and if the movie wasn't there behind it, then you didn't get the damn movie. You couldn't rent it. And I always remember some movies I was looking forward to getting and never could get, and it was hardly ever in. I was like, geez, you almost have to live here at the video store to get. But nowadays, it's not like that. You can get on Netflix, or you can stream online somewhere, or hell, you can even go to YouTube and find videos and movies and stuff like that. Movies are just great from the 80s, man. But, you know, not just renting from the video stores and stuff. I remember the beginning of, like, HBO, you know. And nowadays, there's like 6 or 7 of them. Back then, you had one. I remember HBO. I remember Cinemax, the Movie Channel, and Showtime. That was the ones that I remember the most, and because I just remember them coming out, you know, in the mid 80s and stuff, and you could get on there and watch them and stuff. But, you know, just like nowadays, you have to pay a little extra. Well, we didn't. My dad at the time had a little black box. It was called the Scrambler thing, and pay-per-view was just getting big too around the mid 80s. So he got one of these. I think they paid like $150 for, he said, back then. And we got free, you know, cable. I don't know if we had to pay, I think, like the basic cable stuff. And then we hooked that to it to get like the Showtime, the Cinemax, the HBO, you know, the Movie Channel, and even got pay-per-view, baby. Now, back then, pay-per-view was a lot different than it is now. Now, you just got a bunch of movies. You can pick it. You can pay $5.99 or whatever and watch it. Back then, it was different. You had different channels. There was maybe 3 or 4 different channels. And the movie played over and over and over and over and over. And you just, you know, I think you could call in and order it, or you could do it maybe by the remote. I can't remember exactly. But I do remember seeing like Superman 4, which was a horrible movie. That was on when I remember it first being hooked up. And The Gate was on there. Great horror classic from the 80s, you know, with some kids and stuff in it. There was a movie called No Way Out, too, I remember on there. But not only that, you know, when we first got it, I remember getting the pay-per-views and stuff. But not only than that, but back then, you know, wrestling had WrestleMania, you know, and later on in the late 80s, they had like the Royal Rumble and other things like that. But me being a wrestling fan back then, that was great, too, to get to watch, you know, on pay-per-view, the wrestling and stuff too. I mean, I remember watching WrestleMania 3, and to today, it is still the best WrestleMania and my favorite WrestleMania ever, and I got it on DVD, and just watching that on pay-per-view at your house when that made history with Hulk Hogan versus Andre the Giant, that was just some great shit right there. But I know we're not talking really about wrestling, but I'm just going with the pay-per-view stuff there, you know, from the 80s and stuff, with the movies, of course. But the 80s put out some of the best movies. Yeah, they put out stuff like Back to the Future. The Back to the Future movie, when it first came out, I thought that was the greatest thing. I've always been a fan of time travel. I always would want to go do that. But then after watching Back to the Future back in the day, I was kind of leery of doing it, because you could mess stuff up and make it worse for you, or you could make it better, you know. But they also had the sequels of the Star Wars movies, you know, like The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And you had the Indiana Jones films, which was great. The Karate Kid films. The Karate Kid films I went to see at the theater, Blueprints Theater, it was called back in the day. I got to see part 1, part 2, and part 3 by the end of the 80s. I think the part 3 came out 88, 89, somewhere around there. But I remember seeing every one of them in the theater. At least, like I said, there is another one called The Next Karate Kid. We're not counting that one. We're just the first 3. Of course, the sequels to Rocky. You know, you had Rocky 3 and Rocky 4 came out in the 80s. You know, when Rocky 3 came out with Mr. T and stuff, it's Clubber Lane, that was some great stuff for me. And Rocky 4 was the best soundtrack ever to, you know, a movie. And just Rocky was the best at that time, man. And I remember going to a theater at the time. It was in the mall, but now it's a K&W. Well, few years later in the early 90s, it became a K&W. But it was in the mall. And I remember getting in line and waiting, and the damn theater was so packed they had people sitting in the freaking floor to watch Rocky 4. You don't see that much anymore, you know. I mean, I have been in some movies to see Star Wars and stuff like that, the newer Star Wars movies and stuff, and they'd be kind of pretty crowded and stuff. But back then, that was just something, man, because back then, you know, you watch a trailer on the internet. I mean, not on the internet. You would watch it now on the internet, but back then you just saw it on TV. You didn't know a whole lot about it or whatever. You might see a trailer here and there. You go see it. You know, you couldn't really get a little info on it ahead of time. A whole lot of info, I should say. You can get a little info by a trailer or whatever. But, you know, and the movie posters and stuff to these, just like the VHS cover art back then, you know, the VHS was ruling in the 80s, because that's the only way you could watch them and rent them, you know. And they put a lot of effort into putting these VHS tapes out with some of the best covers. And some of the best covers didn't always have the best movies, but it grabbed your attention. And it grabbed mine when I went into video stores back in the day. I just remember seeing stuff like the Zombie, Lucio Fulci's Zombie. That's one of them, and I got a big box of it now. That movie I wanted to get so bad and couldn't get it, you know, because I wasn't of age or whatever, at a place called Glenwood Video nearby where I lived. Another one was I Spit on Your Grave. When I saw that in the big box, I was like, holy hell. Faces of Death was another one, you know, and later on I got to watch it. That stuff's really not all that great, but I remember seeing that in the video stores too, where you could rent. So there was so much stuff with movies in the 80s, man. You had the Goonies too. The Goonies was great, classic, you know. And you had Stand By Me. A lot of them kid type movies I liked. Of course, like The Lost Boys too, for thriller and, you know, horror stuff aside that. The Lost Boys is great too. And Corey Feldman and Corey Haim just ran the 80s big time in them types of movies. The License to Drive was another good one that they put out together. And, you know, just like the love comedies and stuff like that, you know, and some of the dramas. I watched so much different things back then. I'm staring at a poster I have in my room, Beetlejuice. That's another one, you know. They talk about making a sequel and stuff here soon, but, you know, there was just so much great stuff that came out then. And just like with the music, you also had, you know, they had some one-hit wonders and stuff with music. Well, it's the same way with movies. I mean, some was really good and some was very bad. But then there's some of the bad ones in the 80s that you really didn't care. You still watched and enjoyed it, and they become favorites. And nowadays when you watch them, they're really not as good as they was, but if they're a childhood favorite, you still enjoy watching them. But there's tons and tons of movies that came out in the 80s, but the thing I wanted to talk about the most was the VCR, you know, and I've done a video a long time ago about, you know, my first experience with VCR and VHS tapes and stuff, so I'm not really going to go into that, you know, stuff again. But that, and, you know, being able to go to the theaters and stuff back then that we had, and it seemed a lot more crowdeder, and it's just, I don't know, the atmosphere was so much different then than they are now, and just in the rental stores was the greatest thing growing up in the 80s. Of course, later on in the 90s, Blockbuster killed it and knocked out all the mom and pop shops, they called them, and it just wasn't the same no more after that. And then the internet killed a lot of other stuff, and, you know, streaming and stuff's pretty cool. I do that from time to time. I've had Netflix, and I've had Hulu, and I've seen stuff like that, you know, and that's good for TV shows and stuff like that too. But just to go to the store and rent it, you know, and as a collector, back then, you didn't have no money. I was a kid and stuff, but I did get to get some blank tapes, recorded movies off of HBO, Cinemax, and Showtime, etc. Stuff like that was really cool too, that you could record stuff off of TV and everything. So nowadays, you don't really do that. You have a DVR hooked to you're in your box, and you just hit record, and then you can erase or whatever. There's no tape and all that. I mean, it is, you know, a little bit easier to do nowadays and stuff, and more convenient, you should say. But just growing up there, I'm so glad I grew up in the 80s to experience that, because there will never be another decade like that and with that kind of stuff. And of course, we have cell phones and crazy stuff now, but with that stuff, with the movies and stuff of the 80s, just great. So I'm sure I left out a ton of other movies that came out in the 80s that were classic, great, or might be your favorites, or I might have some more favorites that I just left out and couldn't think of right away, because there's just so damn many movies that came out in the 80s, just like any other decade. But the 80s movies rule for me, and my favorites, a lot of my favorites, in probably my top 100, at least 50 or 60 or maybe even 70 of them came out in the 80s. I have a lot of them in my collection still yet today, and I still will buy a good 80s classic, either be comedy, horror, or drama, or whatever. There were so many great movies in the 80s, and I was glad to be there and live through it. Next time on Remembering the 80s, we're going to talk about what? We're going to talk about the toys. Great toys in the 80s too, baby. So we're going to talk about that next time we roll around here. Not exactly here soon, but we'll make a video eventually called The Toys of the 80s. Till next time.